You're listening to the Dungeons, Dragons, and Psychology Podcast. On this show, we often talk about how a little understanding of psychology can help us build more believable characters, and that immersive, collaborative storytelling comes out through an understanding of how those characters' psychology develops. But what about when we apply those same concepts to monsters and villains in our campaigns? I'm Robert Walker, author of Session Zero, the DMG to writing great campaigns in any system, and this is my show where I teach collaborative storytellers how to create memorable campaigns using psychology. Our guest today has tackled that very idea through his blog and series of books that focus on playing monsters more realistically. And today, I hope that you can learn a lot about how to run your monsters even a little more believably to enhance your storytelling. So let's get right to the interview.
Hi, I'm Keith Ammann. I am the author of the blog, The Monsters Know What They're Doing, and several books that have spun off from that blog. The Monsters Know What They're Doing, Combat Tactics for Dungeon Masters, More Monsters Know What They're Doing, Live to Tell the Tale, Combat Tactics for Player Characters, and my latest one, How to Defend Your Lair.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the show today. I have to say, I have a copy of all of your books. They're all excellent.
Thank you.
One thing that's really interesting to me, and I think the listeners might be interested to know, is that while the first three books you mentioned there are kind of geared more towards that 5th edition, I do a lot of playing in Pathfinder, and we've done some Numenera and other systems. What's really, really cool about your most recent book is it's way compatible with, seems like, any system.
Thank you. That was very intentional.
I don't know if you remember from 3rd edition, the Stronghold Builder's Guidebook was a D&D product that was just like a supplemental book that gave players a lot of ideas for how to build like their base of operations. But I think your book kind of occupies a better space than that because it's applicable to both DMs creating layers for their monsters, but also for players who want to build something defensible for their own base of operations. So all of your books and your blog, pretty recent, 2016 you started the blog?
That's right, yeah.
And then really within the last 3-4 years, you've come out with 4 books, which is a pretty good churn.
It's been a lot of writing, yeah. Well, one of the things that I took pains to do at the very beginning of writing the blog, which I wish I could say I have stuck to, I haven't, but I really wanted to avoid that new blogger syndrome of running out of material, going dead, and being abandoned by all my readers. And so I made sure that I had 3 weeks of material, 3 weeks of every weekday posting material already in the can before I posted the first article. And then I tried to write one every day and post one every day so that I always had material to cover any downtime that I might experience. And that worked very nicely for a long time. That, the 2016 presidential election happened, tilted me, and I never quite got back on my scheduling game since then. But once I was offered a book deal, at that point, I already had a very large amount of material already on the blog that I could make use of. And I had also already written an earlier version of Live to Tell the Tale, which I self-published as an ebook. So I already had a pretty good footing. The only one I've written almost completely from scratch, sui generis, is How to Defend Your Lair. And that knocked me off my blog posting schedule for 13 months. So it's tough to balance that sort of stuff. But I used to be a full-time journalist a long time. And so I can crank out some words when the situation calls for it.
When it's time. So I do want to ask you about something before we jump into the main topic today, which is talking about monster psychology. I wanted to ask you about something I heard you say on a different podcast, which is that you prefer a world where the percentage of spellcasters is roughly equivalent to the percentage of PhD holders in our real world, which is around 1%. I was really fascinated by this idea, and it made a lot of sense to me, but I wanted to ask you to share with my listeners why it is that you prefer this sort of sparsity in Magic.
I think it's more like 2%, but yeah, I think Magic should be rare. And the reason is that Magic should still feel magical. You know, if you say 1 in 10 people or more can cast spells, then one of two things happens. Magic becomes totally mundane and unremarkable, and everywhere you go, people have magic watering cans watering their plants for them, magic cookware preparing their food, magic taxis carrying people around town. Or the ones who can do magic band together and oppress the hell out of the ones who can't. Or maybe both. Now, if you go in the other direction, where the only people who can do magic are like Merlin and a couple of other people, then magic becomes something that either only happens to the player characters or only happens because of the player characters, and you lose a lot of that sense of wonder in the broader world.
Yeah.
So I like this happy medium where many people will encounter magic a few times in their lives, and few people will encounter magic many times in their lives. But by and large, the world of magic exists apart from and alongside the everyday world. And if you need to use magic for some reason and you can't do it yourself, you have to approach someone who can and ask them for a favor and interface with that realm. And those bridge between realms moments are interesting to me.
Yeah, I think another interesting thing that it kind of does that makes a lot of sense in a fantasy setting is that it means that the characters who really are heroes are really the ones who are best off to deal with monsters or things of that nature that might have resistances to attacks that are not magical or things like that.
Yeah. Zombies in your garden, take a scroll of protection from undead off of your shelf. You know, it's
right.
Yeah, that's too much magic for me. So, you know, then it doesn't feel magical anymore.
Yeah, exactly. So today our main topic is monster psychology, or rather, what is it that the monsters in our games are thinking about? How should they act to be more realistic? And how should they respond in combat to protect their assets or protect their own lives? So first, Keith, can you give me a general synopsis of what you've learned about monster behavior in all your writing? How should they act differently from the way that they're sometimes normally ran by dungeon masters?
I've been playing for many years. I did go on kind of a long hiatus in the middle, but I played a long time ago and I came back. And even from my earliest years in role-playing gaming, I've always liked to think of the game world, the game setting, as like this clockwork machine whose parts all keep running even when you're not looking at them. You know, the monsters in the dungeon don't just wake up when the PCs show up and react to their presence. They live in the dungeon for a reason. They've got stuff to do. And when there aren't PCs sniffing around, they spend their time doing it. So when the PCs show up, the monsters should be in the process of whatever they'd normally be doing. They live in a web of relationships with the other inhabitants of the dungeon. And maybe they have rivalries and can't go certain places because it's dangerous for them. Maybe they have allies they work together with and exchange information with. And when intruders show up, they feel an obligation to go tell someone. And they're not all maniacs who always fight to the death, because that's a maladaptive evolutionary strategy. They want to survive, which means sometimes they get scared and run. The video game style always attack and always fight to the death strategies don't ring true. And they make the game world feel more artificial, less like a living world. And I like that sense of a living world where things are going on all the time, even when you're not there.
I agree. I think one of those things that I mentioned in my book several times, and I've talked about it on this show a lot, is the idea of how to make your games feel more believable, feel more realistic, make it easier for you to have a suspension of disbelief. And I think you're exactly right. Just that hack and slash, fighting to the death all the time isn't the way that a real world is going to operate, especially when you're talking about some of these monsters that have incredibly high intelligence scores, sometimes much more intelligent than your party members.
Sometimes
Is
more intelligent than your dungeon master, which
well,
is
yeah, and
a problem you have to learn to tackle.
exactly. Yeah. I think that is an interesting thing, is learning how to play stats that are either much higher or much lower than you actually have in real life. And how do you faithfully represent that in a game? Is there anything specific that you think is more often overlooked when a dungeon master is just pulling out the monster manual and running a monster ad hoc?
One thing that is particularly hard is deciding which spells a creature or a character will cast when it has a large repertoire of them. And Wizards of the Coast has clearly come to understand that and started moving in a different direction with Monsters of the Multiverse to try to cut down on the supermarket fatigue. But I began writing The Monsters Know in the first place because I had run a published encounter with goblins and hadn't put together how I was supposed to use that nimble escape trait in combination with the other things that goblins might do. I wasn't thinking of it yet as an essential part of the goblin's personality that would inform their combat style overall. And I wasn't thinking about how they would exploit it to gain advantage. The rule for hiding is hard to grasp the implications of because it's not in the same place in the player's handbook as the effects of the various conditions, which are all stuck way in the back in
Right.
Appendix A. So you got to do a fair amount of synthesis just to get to the point where you realize goblins can hide easily. Hiding makes you unseen. An unseen attacker has advantage on the attack roll.
Mm-hmm.
So goblins will attack from hiding whenever they can.
Right.
To find the latent combinations in monsters' stat blocks, you really have to know by heart which conditions make the biggest difference. And those are blinded, charmed, grappled, invisible, paralyzed, prone, restrained, stunned, and unconscious. The others you can kind of take or leave, but if you see one of those particular conditions in the stat block of a monster or an NPC, as a writer on one of the things that they can do to an opponent, then you should start looking for the tactical combinations.
I heard you say on a previous podcast, which is right in line with what you're talking about right here, is that if there's anything a dungeon master wanted to memorize, conditions are probably at the top of that list.
Absolutely. I don't think they should be stuck all the way back in Appendix A. I think they should be a big sidebar box in the middle of the combat chapter with arrows pointing to it.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's one of those things that you have to look up more frequently than anything else because conditions happen so often. Almost every combat has an experience with some sort of condition, either that the players are applying to the monsters are applying to the players.
Now, I will say it's very smart of WotC on all of their Dungeon Master screens to give so much real estate on those screens to the conditions and what they mean and what effects they have, because that's something people really need to know. And until you've memorized that, that's something you're going to be wanting to refer back to constantly.
I agree with that as well. Like you said on that other podcast as well, I think pretty much anything else, put some sticky notes in your DMG so that you can find what you're looking for quickly.
Yes.
But to really keep the game flowing, know what the conditions are and how they're going to affect combat and gameplay right away. Mm-hmm. How much time or how much energy do you think that a dungeon master needs to put in to preparing for a boss battle, building out their lair, and preparing the monsters to be ready to fight when the player characters arrive?
Well, before COVID turned all my gaming virtual, my prep to session ratio was about 1-to-1, about 2 hours planning for a 2-hour session. Now, for face-to-face play, I don't mind just drawing an abstract map on a battle map with markers and using miniature poker chips for all the creatures that aren't particularly important.
Yeah.
But if I'm using a virtual tabletop, I feel compelled to draw pretty maps with dungeon scrawl and download graphics packs for terrain and make tokens for all my NPCs in Hero Forge, download monster tokens from printable heroes and so on. And that ends up doubling the time because I'm a control freak and I can't just Microsoft Paint it. you know. And then I have to upload all the tokens and place them on the map and label them with names and hit points and put the invisible and undiscovered stuff on the DM layer. And it ends up being more like 2-to-1 or even 3-to-1 or 4-to-1. And it just makes me want to cry. Because the other thing is that I'm always having to fight the tech to get it to do what I want it to do.
Yeah.
But that's me. Should I be putting that amount of time into prep? Of course not. I wish I could get myself not to, and I know better and I do it anyway. Once you've picked your boss, given it some minions, decided what it knows and what its goals are, which is very important, and come up with a combat heuristic based on that. Prepping the battle shouldn't take
Mm-hmm.
The lair, on the other hand, you should give a lot of thought to, but also you should be doing that early on. That should be one of the things you're coming up with as soon as you know this villain is going to exist. It should be part of bringing the villain into the world. And I would spend a good amount of time on that because creating the lair is part of creating the villain. It's part of developing that story. What's the villain up to? What do they need to have and need to know in order to do that? Where do they do it? And why there? What do they care about? What are they afraid of? What do they possess that they need to protect? Who do they need to protect it from? The lair is an outgrowth of all of these questions. So I would say you should take the time to develop it early on, because for one thing, the PCs might have reason to visit that lair even before they have any intention of picking a fight with the villain.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And speaking to your point on building out the layer, I think if I look back over many of the games that I've run, some of the most memorable combats are the ones where the layer and the terrain and all of those little tiny components were really well thought out so that basically every step that the players took through the layer meant something. It wasn't just like going
That's
to a random
fun
room.
when you can do that.
It is, and it's really intriguing to see how invested the characters can get when the layer itself kind of tells the story, and it's not just a random dungeon that has really no cohesiveness. Can you speak a little bit to you briefly mentioned it, what the monsters are protecting? I've read you've talked about it in their assets.
Right.
Can you talk a little bit about that, and what is a monster thinking when they build a layer to protect their assets, or how do they go about deciding what is the right way to protect their assets?
Well, I mean, that depends on the type of monster. It depends on that monster's personality and psychology and, way of seeing the world. One of the things I go over in How to Defend Your Lair is how different creature types prioritize what I call the 3 L's: loot, lore, and lives. If you have just, humanoids, for example, most of your humanoids are going to be very concerned with protecting their lives and possibly others' lives. They're going to be moderately to very concerned about protecting loot, depending on the value of that loot and the importance to them, both sentimental importance and also just practicality. Like, do I need this to do my job? Do I need this to keep the local lord off my back or whatever? They're not going to care about lore very much unless they are scholars or spies or members of some kind of esoteric society or religious sect. Then they're going to start caring about lore a lot. But it really depends on their job and their position in society, whether or not they care about lore. And, maybe their degree of education, which also has a lot to do with their position in society.
Right.
Now, dragons care about loot. Dragons are all about loot. Dragons, if anything, are slightly more concerned with protecting loot than even with protecting lives. They will put their own lives on the line to keep anyone from taking their loot. That's just like at the core of being a dragon. You care about loot. You gotta have the loot. You always want more loot. And everything is about protecting the loot. you got a beast. Beast does not care about lore at all, probably doesn't even care about loot. Unless it's like a magpie with something shiny in its nest.
Yeah.
And you know what? If something really big and scary comes after the shiny trinket in the magpie nest, the magpie's going to fly away. It is not going to defend the shiny trinket. It only cares about its life. And so on. And you just can go through all the different types. Fiends and celestials. They might not really care about at all. They'll care about lives. At least celestials will. Fiends not so much. They'll care about lore if it's something related to them. But what they will really care about is people trespassing places where they don't belong. Fiends and celestials are both going to be really uptight about it. And so now, instead of defending loot or defending lore, they are just trying to make sure that only the right entities get into the areas that they consider to be highly charged with importance.
Fascinating. There's something else I've heard you mention a few times that I think is pretty applicable to the way that a monster thinks, and it's specifically had to do with their lair, which is, I believe you talked about defense, deterrence, and
detection, deterrence, and response. Yes.
Yes.
Which is what those three little goblins on the cover are meant to illustrate.
Nice.
Yeah, so those are the three components of any defensive plan. You have to be able to detect an intrusion or a potential intrusion. You have to have measures in place to try to make intruders not want to intrude.
Yeah.
To winnow down the number of people who decide to try you. And then you need some kind of response measure in place in case the deterrence doesn't work. And if your defensive plan is missing any of those things, then it's incomplete. Like, for example, you might have very good deterrence and very good response, but no detection. So when there is an intrusion, if somebody does get past your deterrent measures, you're going to be scrambling trying to find them and deal with them. You might have enough people on hand to do the job, or enough, monster minions or whatever. But if you don't know where they are, or if you can't mobilize fast enough, you might lose something just as you're realizing that somebody was after it. If you have detection and response, but no deterrence, people are going to be testing you all the time. And if you have detection and deterrence, but no response, then if somebody gets in, you're without any recourse.
Right. You've mentioned many times about the importance of being able to retreat, and I know you kind of briefly talked about it in here. Not everybody wants to stand their ground.
Right.
Sometimes the best option for a monster, just like it is for the PCs, the best option is retreat.
Yeah. And in that case, you have to know how the value of your assets compares with the value of your own life. Because there may be an instance in which you have reason to spend more resources defending a particular piece of loot or lore than you do on defending your own life. And in a situation like that, you have to figure out, is this something I'm actually going to put my life at risk to protect? Or is this something that I'm going to try to protect so well that I can run away and come back later with reasonable confidence that the intruders won't have gotten? Yeah. Or is it something I need to pick up and carry off with me?
Right. Yeah, I know
or should I just abandon it? I mean, there are lots of things.
My life's far more valuable.
You might have one of the things I recommend is that you start with the list of all of the assets the villain has, and you rate their value and their criticality, the need that the villain is going to have to protect each one. And then you work your way down from the most valuable to the least valuable. And you'll probably have a passel of things down at the bottom where it's like, nah, I can ditch these. I don't care about these. It's the things at the top that I really need to focus on protecting. And if I flee, I might grab them and take them with me. or I need to make sure that if I am driven out of my own lair, that the intruders still can't get them.
I think one thing that you do really well on your blog and in your books is you break down not just round by round, which is something that D&D has kind of done in certain scenarios, but you do a really good job of saying like at what distance a monster wants to begin combat or start using the abilities that they have. So you kind of break things out based on not just what round they're going to do things in, but what area of effect they're going to have and how effective they're going to be as the PCs get closer and closer. I think that's a really clever way of doing it.
Yeah, because there are lots of potential trigger conditions aside from combat breaks out, everyone roll initiative, it's round one.
Right.
There are all kinds of things, especially if there are detection measures in place, especially if a monster or an NPC is intelligent. They're going to start reacting as soon as they know something's going on. They're not just going to sit in the bare rectangular room 14 and wait for you to walk in the door. They're going to be taking whatever preventive measures they can from the moment that they become aware of it. They're going to scram. They're going to go on yellow or red alert.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that to me is fundamental.
I think one of my favorite encounters that I've ever played with a big boss had a layer that was really designed for them to be extremely mobile and to interact with the players so many different times during that time they're exploring the layer. And I think they just, they have time to hit and run and recharge and refill their life while they're away and then come back and do it again. I think that makes not only interesting, but a little more believable about you're in my home. I know where everything is. You don't.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Especially good if I'm thinking of the one you're thinking of, especially good for creatures that can sometimes walk through a wall.
That is, yes. just put my players.
I know what's on the other side of that wall. You, dear visitor, may not.
That's right. Awesome. Let's go ahead and move on to tricks of the trade. In today's Tricks of the Trade, I've asked Keith to share a few simple steps to make your monsters or villains more believable. I also brought one of my own, which I'll go first to give you just a moment to collect your thoughts. So my idea is when you're building your monsters as a dungeon master, treat them like you're building a character. You put a lot of time and energy and thought into the way that your character is going to survive in a myriad of circumstances, and you have assets at your disposal to deal with whatever weaknesses you might have, whatever cleverness the DM might throw at you. So approach building your monsters with that same sort of gusto. You're the DM. You have all the resources available at your fingertips. Don't just go with what's in the book. Make it make sense for the layer and for the story.
I would say play around with the disconnects between what the PCs know and what the villain knows, and between what the villain knows and what their henchmen know, and so on. This is, for me, this is a source of endless fascination and endless amusement. I have always loved the epistemology of role-playing games. So many encounters can turn on the fact that someone knows something that someone else doesn't, or doesn't know something that someone else does. It's a great way to believably nerf an otherwise extremely powerful villain who might make a brilliant decision that would be totally optimal if what they think is true were true, but since it's not true, it ends up hurting them. I ran a game in which one of the villains decided to assassinate a PC who was leading forces against him, but he was arrogant and he jumped to the wrong conclusion about which PC was leading the forces and ended up sending his assassin after the paladin instead of the barbarian. And the big difference this made, since I wasn't actually going to outright murder either one of them, it turned the mood of the adventure. Before that point, it had been very much, this guy's a juggernaut. How are we going to stop him? But after the botched assassination, it became, this guy's underestimating us.
Yeah.
He doesn't know who's really after him. He's just guessing. And it gave the party a little extra juice to keep pushing forward against him.
I'm trying to even remember the movie now, but there's some line that says, well, their arrogance. And like, arrogant, that's his only weakness. And said, well, it can be enough. If you play it right, you can play to whatever weakness the enemy presents to the party. That is awesome. Okay, so before we sign off, let me give you the opportunity to share with the Cyclothids where to find your blog, get your books, follow you on social media, anything else you want to talk about.
My blog is The Monsters Know What They're Doing. It's themonstersknow.com, all run together, no punctuation. My books are published by Saga Press, an imprint of Simon & Schuster. They are trade books, so you can buy them at your local independent bookstore or on bookshop.org or Barnes & Noble or Amazon, or a new one I just discovered called tertulia.com. It's I'm interested to see how much that becomes a player. If you want to order from your friendly local game store, they are carried by ACD Distribution. If your game store doesn't deal with ACD, they can order wholesale from Simon & Schuster Distribution. And on social media, I am Keith Ammann at dice.camp on Mastodon. I'm no longer on Twitter. So right now it's Mastodon, and we'll see what else comes onto the scene.
Awesome. Well, I just want to thank you so much for coming on today and talking to us about monsters. And again, just say how much I really love your books. And in some ways, my players probably hate them because of the things that they've been put through. But to your credit, you've come up with those ways to help players as well. Now, in your last two books, really kind of seem to be a little more geared towards both sides of the table.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me.
All right, Cyclothids, let's head over to our knowledge check. For today's knowledge check, I thought it would be very apropos to look at the first book that our guest wrote, and that is The Monsters Know What They're Doing, Combat Tactics for Dungeon Masters by Keith Ammann. And what I wanted to focus on today was just a few simple, what he calls assumptions that he makes at the very beginning of the book, assumptions that a DM should assume a monster is going to behave in a certain way based on a few simple things. The first is he mentions that with only a few exceptions, monsters are concerned first and foremost with their own survival. Now, obviously, the exceptions could be things like guardians or undead, things that are programmed like constructs to behave in a certain way and maybe fight to the death. But for the most part, your monsters aren't going to stand up and just fight to the death for no reason. They would have to be protecting something that they believe is more valuable than their own life. Otherwise, their first instinct, especially with intelligent creatures, is going to be seeing to their own survival and longevity. And next, that their ability scores, especially physical ability scores, will sort of dictate the way that they behave during combat. For example, a creature that has an incredibly high dexterity is probably going to choose stealth or ambush attacks, while a creature that has a low constitution and strength score is probably going to seek strength in numbers. Think of things like goblins, where they are going to attack in very large groups. And if you have a low dexterity score, you might be waiting for a very opportunistic moment to attack because you know you're not going to have the maneuverability to escape as easily as other creatures. When it comes to the mental ability scores, a creature with a low intelligence, like 7 or less, is going to act mostly on instinct. So as a dungeon master, you should think, what would the instincts of a creature in this situation, in this location, be during a combat? If they are surprised and they are found unaware, their first instinct might simply to be fleeing from the scene of the combat, not to stand there and fight, because again, they are thinking of their own survival. Whereas a creature with a low wisdom might not have that sense of flight ingrained in it. They might wait too long to flee. But as these ability scores increase, the dungeon master should take note of that as they are playing the characters or the monsters, because if they have a very high intelligence, then the creature itself is probably not going to be unprepared. They have probably thought through many different contingencies for not only their own escape, but also the protection of their own space. And the same goes for wisdom. They are probably going to do whatever is most clever in a given moment in terms of being able to know when to negotiate or know when to back away, be very meticulous about when the right time for an attack is, because they sort of have that innate sense of when things are going their way and when they are not. And the last point that I will give you from his list of assumptions or ideas for things the Dungeon Master should always keep in mind would be consider the features that the monster has. Like, do they have any things like area of effect abilities, or do they have a feature that give it advantage on any of its rolls or cause disadvantage for any of the other players? A monster will always seek to use these unique abilities because they were given to the creature to design the way that it thinks about combat. So if it can force disadvantage on a player, it is always going to have a better opportunity to be successful when they give that disadvantage to another player. Or if they have the ability to affect creatures with an area of an effect ability, they want to find times to utilize that when they have the most number of targets who are going to be susceptible to their ability. So that is all for today. Another huge thank you to Keith Ammann for joining us on the show. It was a lot of fun having him here and really hearing his very intuitive insights to monster psychology. Next week, we will have Nate and Chris back with us again to talk about the power of 3. And as always, follow us on Instagram and Facebook. And you can reach out to me by email if you like, dungeonsdragonpsychology@gmail.com. And if you'd like, we also have a website where you can become a cyclithid, sign up for information and news coming out from my site specifically. It is www.dungeonsdragonpsychology.com. Until next time, we'll see you next session.